This is Dr. Don Easterbrook, Western Washington University. His argument on CO2 is incapable of causing global warming. This was given in 2013 at a Washington Senate hearing on global warming, climate change.
Here's a critical question. Is CO2 capable of causing global warming? That's what underlies all of these discussions. And that's the main contention of the whole climate change debate. What you may not be aware of is that there's almost no CO2 in the atmosphere. It's very small. It's 39 one-thousandths of 1%. If we take a bucket of air out of this room and measure it, we will get 39 one-thousandths of 1% CO2. It's almost nothing. If you double nothing, you've still got nothing. Since 1950s, since this big escalation of emission of CO2, the composition of the atmosphere, the CO2 composition, has increased by only 8 one-thousandths of 1%. That's almost as close to nothing as you can get. You can triple that and you still have nothing. There is not enough CO2 in the atmosphere to do much of anything. And then you add to that CO2 accounts for only 3.6% of the greenhouse effect. Only 3% of the greenhouse gas effect is CO2. 95% is water vapor. So the point of this is that CO2 by itself is incapable of significant global warming. That's the bottom line. I'll say it again. CO2 by itself is incapable of causing significant global warming. And so how do we get these projections in? And we get it because the climate modelers who depend on computer models rather than real data for their conclusions have decided that if CO2 goes up, water vapor will also increase. And as water vapor increases, we kick in this 95% of the greenhouse effect. So virtually all of the temperature increase during the warm period that we had in 77 to 98, virtually all of that they would account for by water vapor in their models, not CO2, water vapor. So the question is water vapor increasing? Well, here's water vapor. Here's water vapor going back to 1947. Water vapor, if water vapor is increasing as CO2 goes up, and that's what's levering the global warming, then you might have an argument for their models. But water vapor has actually decreased since 1947. Look at the downward trend. Down is less water vapor in the atmosphere. And these are various levels of the atmosphere. So in order for their models to be correct, they must show that there has been an increase in water vapor in the atmosphere, and it's just the opposite. There is less water vapor in the atmosphere now as CO2 has gone up, not more, and so their models are totally invalid. Their models will not work without an increase in water vapor. There's another effect of CO2, which is called a saturation effect. If you take a dry sponge and dip it in a bucket of water, it'll soak up water. If you take a wet sponge and put it in a bucket of water, it doesn't soak up very much more water, does it? Because it's already saturated. And CO2 operates the same way. There's a saturation level wherein the CO2, which is in the atmosphere right now, is mostly saturated with respect to capturing of the frequencies of heat. And so on this curve right here, this is the degree in possible temperature change with increasing in atmospheric carbon dioxide. This 1950 level is right here, 2008 level is right here. The maximum amount of temperature change you could get from the increase in CO2 from 1950, when the whole thing started to escalate for emissions, and now is less than 1/10 of a degree. This is basic physics. What about just making a correlation between CO2 and temperature? On this curve, this is atmospheric temperature. Atmospheric CO2 on this side, and surface temperature on this side. So here's the CO2 curve, which has been increasing, been going up steadily, no doubt about it. From 1915 to 1945, we had global warming with no increase appreciably in CO2. So CO2 didn't cause that warming in this century, hotter than it is now. And then when CO2 was escalating in 1945 on, we actually had global cooling. The curve is actually going the opposite direction as the CO2 curve. If CO2 causes global warming, why do we have 30 years of global cooling when it began to escalate? Doesn't make any sense. It's only in this last period from 1978 to 1998 when the two have coincided by coincidence. We can also show that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere always follows an increase in temperature, not the other way around. The idea would be that if CO2 is causing global warming, CO2 would go up, and then the temperature would go up. Okay? But here's what actually happens. And these are measurements that have been made by a group of researchers in Norway. The blue curve down here is temperature. Temperature's been going up and down, as it does every few years, largely because of ocean changes. And this is the CO2 content of the atmosphere. In every case, temperature goes up, and then CO2 follows. If CO2 was causing this temperature to go up, it should precede it, but it doesn't. It follows it in every case, and by about the same amount. And this is for short-term changes. The same is true for long-term changes. So the conclusions about CO2 is that the amount in the atmosphere is minuscule. The total change is so small that there is absolutely no way it can cause global warming by itself. It's totally dependent on water vapor, and there's no correlation between global temperatures and CO2. When CO2 goes up, temperature does whatever it wants to do. The comparison of computer model predictions of global warming, when you compare those to actual measurements to see if the models were right, they are totally inaccurate. The models are totally inaccurate. And I'll show you an instance of that in just a minute. The bottom line is CO2 is not capable of causing significant global warming by itself. That's clear from the physics. CO2 is a result of global warming, not the cause of global warming. As you increase the temperature, you increase the CO2 in the atmosphere because there's more that's given up by the oceans.
Dr. Easterbrook, you use the term greenhouse effect.
Oh, I'm sorry. A greenhouse effect is caused by certain gases that will absorb certain frequencies in the electromagnetic spectrum, namely heat. And so the idea would be that as heat is coming from the surface of the Earth upward, being radiated back, and
So CO2 is always a trailing indicator of warming. So as warming goes up, the oceans warm up, and CO2 comes out of the oceans because the solubility of CO2 as well as oxygen is much enhanced at colder temperatures.